There's a reason flash storage isn't called electronic non-volatile memory storage. IBM Flash Storage is fast, cloud-ready, scalable and surprisingly affordable. Order by the 30th of June and pay nothing for 90 days. Find out more at ibm.biz/flash offer.
Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Adam Shepherd.
Welcome to the ITPro podcast, your weekly guide to the most important topics in the IT industry.
So Jane, what have you been up to? How's your week been?
I finally finished Death Stranding, which I know that I mentioned at the intro of last week's episode, so that was confusing because it's a Hideo Kojima production, and I went to bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, which is ill-advised when you have to be up and start work the next day.
Yeah, also, that seems like a very quick turnaround. Don't Hideo Kojima games typically last for 32 million years?
I'd been playing it for a while, and to be honest with you, there's a cutscene at the end that kind of explains everything that's just happened over the past X number of weeks or months you've been playing it, that goes on for over an hour. There are 3 cutscenes, they go on for over an hour, and I skipped the last one because I knew it was going to happen. I went to bed cross.
So speaking of things taking far, far longer than they have any right to, our first story this week is about the UK's rather underwhelming 5G infrastructure.
Yes, to call it lethargic would perhaps be giving it a bit too much praise. Average UK 5G downloads speeds are lagging behind South Korea, Australia and the US, and indeed are 3 times slower than they are in the US. So much for 5G being super, super fast.
It's not really the transformational innovation that we've been promised for the last couple of years.
I mean, the annoying thing is it could be, it really could be, because it demonstrably could be from what's going on elsewhere. But, I mean, the fact that people keep setting fire to 5G masts probably not particularly helpful, as was most recently the case in Liverpool. It's ridiculous. It was so hyped for so long, and now it's here, and it's a disappointment.
So given that the UK is lagging so far behind the rest of the world, what is the reason that might be?
Yeah, well, I mean, infrastructure and investment is the obvious thing. And speaking of which, the UK, I mean, the government just can't make up their mind either about, suppliers. There are not loads of...
Supplier.
Well, yes, there aren't loads of 5G suppliers, 5G infrastructure suppliers. Huawei is probably the biggest. And the UK government decided that they could have a limited role in the 5G infrastructure of the country after a review, because everyone's worried about security. They've changed their mind on that, and Huawei technology has to be out of Britain's 5G networks by 2023. So that sounds super helpful when it comes to making our 5G networks as good as they are in anywhere else.
Yeah, it's worth highlighting that Huawei is one of, if not the biggest names in the 5G space, and critics of the government's plan to limit Huawei's role in the UK's 5G infrastructure were saying, all throughout the process, that ripping Huawei out of existing infrastructure and preventing it from having any greater role in future infrastructure would lead to the UK falling behind in terms of 5G development. And lo and behold, here we are. I mean, the fact that Huawei is pretty much the best game in town when it comes to 5G is not really up for debate at this point. And it's a question of whether or not we are willing to sacrifice progress in 5G development for the sake of added security, potentially.
Yeah, potentially being a key part there. I mean, it just really bugs me. It just really bugs me. And it's like a circular argument as well, because initially, like you said, it was let's rip all the Huawei stuff out. And then the network operators were like, if you do that, there's not going to be a network. And they were like, okay, well, they can have a limited role. Then they have a limited role. It's like, oh no, actually, you have to get rid of it again. Give it a fortnight, and it'll be fine again, and everything can run on Huawei infrastructure.
In other news, Microsoft is having a little bit of a shocker this week after it's advised Windows 10 users not to manually update to the latest feature update for Windows 10 in fear of a massive rash of bugs.
Yes, nobody likes being overrun by bugs, especially not a slightly comedic 10 bugs for Windows 10. Ha 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 ha. Pause for laughter. This update had already been delayed by 2 weeks. Like, it's just a hot mess. It's a real mess.
There's bugs affecting everything from Bluetooth connections to 4G to Intel graphics drivers to a whole mess of things. And it's especially embarrassing considering that it comes a week after Microsoft's major developer conference when it announced, sweeping new product updates, a bunch of new features, all this kind of stuff. And it does sort of raise the question, well, where are your priorities, guys?
Insert not a bug but a feature joke here. Yeah, I mean, one of the bugs that there's a blue screen of death possible when external Thunderbolt docks are plugged in or unplugged. Just kind of flashbacks to when, if you removed a disk without ejecting it, like that could be the end of your computer, kind of thing. It's just it's kind of embarrassing, actually, really. Just for, like I say, not just because it comes just after build, but because the whole reason for the original delay was that there was a bug problem. They delayed it because it was full of bugs, fixed the bugs, and then released it with a whole bunch of bugs.
It's like ants. Where you see one, there's always more.
A nest of bugs in your operating system.
Microsoft's current advice for any Windows 10 users is not to manually install the latest version of the updates, despite the fact that it's packing a number of cool and interesting new features, but to wait while Microsoft investigates the issues and tries to patch some of them.
Finally, HP has revealed a new range of devices aimed at people who are working from home.
That's right. The company has unveiled more than 20 new products across categories like desktops, thin clients, laptops, monitors, a whole range of stuff.
Yeah, I did find, it's interesting that it's sort of like, work from home. It's 20 products overall. Most are laptops, the EliteBook range, Elite One, Firefly, mobile workstations, i.e. heavy laptops, plus a few kind of desktops. And I did find it interesting, the idea of kind of like remote working desktops. Because the idea of remote working now is it's been kind of like mobility. So look, here's this lightweight laptop, and here's this tablet, and all that kind of thing. It almost made me think: are we kind of moving away from the idea of mobility just to remoteness? So perhaps it's nice to have a big old desktop. I know that I like working on my iMac at the moment.
I mean, yeah, the fact is that desktops do offer a level of functionality that a lot of laptops don't. It's easier to fit, for example, higher-end processors and graphics cards and whatnot into a desktop form factor than it is into a laptop because, you don't have to take as much heed of things like, thermal efficiency and cooling and the impact on battery life and that kind of thing. And also, there is the simple fact that the market for desktops, particularly at the moment, is going to be a lot bigger because guess what? You don't have to go anywhere anymore.
Do you not have to go anywhere? Really, you shouldn't.
Unless you're trying to test your eyesight, of course.
Oh, ban. There's also the issue, actually, of just the kind of the setup of it. I'm on my laptop at the moment. I have to look down at it, even though it's on a stand. I don't know. Yeah, I think possibly we could really see a resurgence of it. Also, this is where the money is. If we're all working remotely, then the money is not so much in data centers, unless you're looking at hyperscale, but it is in kit to work in one place, which is not a centralized office.
I mean, yeah, the fact is, about 2 weeks into the lockdown, you could not get a laptop for love nor money. And, as this situation becomes more and more bedded in, I mean, despite quarantines kind of starting to lift, I think a lot of office-based organizations are going to remain either fully or partly remote for a significant period after this. I mean, remote working kit is going to continue to be in high demand.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a feature I know coming out in the next edition, I believe, of the business briefing about just that. Organisations, some are just like they've gone remote and they're like, well, this is it forever. Actually, we quite like this. The general consensus is that we're going to be operating a hybrid model. So yeah, good on HP. It's going to bump up their share price a little bit, returning to the olden days of the proposed Xerox takeover.
Those are the days.
Indeed.
Well, it's time for us to take a short break now, but when we come back, we're going to be talking to data protection expert Dyann Heward-Mills about the second anniversary of GDPR and what, if anything, has changed about corporate data protection in the last 2 years.
See you after the break.
The IBM Flash storage solution can be broken down into 3 S's. Speed, retrieve data fast and efficiently. Scalability, grow your storage as your business grows. Simplicity, easily migrate and integrate with existing systems. Oh, and there's a 4th. It's surprisingly affordable, with a recommended monthly price from as little as 1,300 kroner. Order by the 30th of June and pay nothing for 90 days. Visit ibm.biz/flash offer now.
Welcome back. It's now 2 years since GDPR came into force amongst much fanfare, with expectations that there would be huge fines and a complete change in the way that businesses deal with personal data. There was also a lot of anxiety on the part of those data handlers themselves, and anybody really running any kind of online business or running an email campaign.
To tell us more about the realities of GDPR 2 years in and how companies' approaches to data protection have changed in that time, I'd like to welcome Dyann Heward-Mills to the podcast. Dyann, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invite.
So, obviously, fines have been a kind of huge component of GDPR. The maximum penalties under GDPR are significantly higher than basically any other data protection act that, I think the world has seen up until its enforcement. But so far, we haven't really seen the huge fines that many were predicting and are permitted now under GDPR. The top end of those fines has been yet to show its face, really. Why is that, do you think?
So I think there has been a lot of focus on fines, and there was this expectation once that the GDPR became effective that the regulators were going to come out all guns blazing. And there have been a number of high-profile fines, not just from the UK, but also other regulators. The CNIL, which is the French regulator, issued a fine against Google of 50 million euros, and that received a lot of focus and attention. The UK's regulator, the Information Commissioner's Office, mentioned an intention to fine both BA and Marriott quite significant sums. And again, there was a lot of focus and attention on that. They haven't fully materialised, in particular the ICO fines, because they're being appealed. And I don't think that is unusual. I think that's to be expected. And in particular, the Irish regulator, the Data Protection Commission, mentioned that they're going to be very careful and considered about fines, because they know organisations do have significant resources at their disposal, armies of lawyers who can advise them on grounds for appeal. So I think, there definitely have been the headline grabbing fines, but the reality is that it is a long process. And I think importantly, also, organisations should consider the monetary penalties that can be imposed, including, the right to audit. I suspect we're going to see a lot more of those types of penalties being pursued by regulators, and in particular post-COVID, and also the ability for regulators to actually mandate that an organisation stops its processing activity. So actually to stop business, which operationally would be incredibly impactful. So I think, yes, that we are definitely likely to see fines being issued, and they will be challenged. That's to be expected. But my expectation is that there will also be other non-monetary penalties that would be enforced, which could be just as effective, actually. And also importantly, just public opinion, beyond the actual monetary penalties. I think the damage to brand being associated with non-compliance or being perceived as an organization that doesn't treat data with a sort of care and respect and appropriate levels of security be very damaging from a brand reputation perspective.
Do you think then that perhaps, especially in the run-up to GDPR coming into effect across Europe and in its manifestation as the Data Protection Act here, that there was just kind of maybe too much emphasis on the whole fines thing and not enough on the other weapons in the arsenal, if you like?
I mean, it's my personal opinion that over focus on fines is actually distracting and not perhaps the right way to think about things. I think, as you've mentioned, some of the other sanctions that are available to regulators are far more effective. And the purpose of legislation like the GDPR is really was to put control back in the hands of individuals and for them to be able to determine who has access to their data and what is done with it. Now, these rights are not absolute. So there are situations where organizations are able to access and use data without the necessary approval or consent of individuals, and COVID is a very good example of that, where there is a public interest or other reason why data should be handled and used or accessed by organizations. But trust is fundamental in all of this. And so I think that's a better way really of looking at this whole issue is without that trust and the buy-in of individuals, whether they are consumers, other stakeholders, employees, patients, you won't get the take up of technology. You won't be able to innovate in the way that organizations need to innovate and that benefits society as a whole. So I think, rather than focus on the fines, organizations would do well to think about, are we going to set ourselves apart as being a brand that can be trusted? And, trust is a very difficult thing to attain and very easily lost.
Yeah.
And so that should be the job of regulators too, to help those organizations that want to do the right thing, because these rules can be very complex, to offer them support. Not all organizations will have the same level of resources that the big social media platform and other technology giants have. And I think that's where actually regulators can be focused in also educating and offering the requisite support.
It's interesting as well that you mention, COVID and you mentioned trust, because I will admit to being a very online person, and I see that there's a lot of concern over the track and trace app. There is a level of mistrust there. There have already been some negative stories, and in order to get this kind of large scale thing working, you need to have, like you say, the trust there that their data is going to be handled responsibly, that there's nothing nefarious going on. And I think it's a bit of a worry, actually.
Absolutely, and that's why this really does matter. It's so important, and there is a job to be done. And again, perhaps it's because the technology needs to be better explained. There needs to be clearer transparency around what purposes the data would be put to, and what's done once those purposes have been met. Are there going to be secondary purposes to which that data? I think that's where the mistrust and the concern and the fear comes in, and it's actually the job of those who are responsible for the app, for governments, to actually be accountable and transparent about exactly what they're intending to do.
So one of the objections that I've seen raised to the involvement of companies like Google in particular is that there seems to be this perception that Google, when it comes to data collection and data processing, basically does what it wants. It processes data however it likes, and when it does get pulled up on data misuse, it will appeal and fight the accusations until they go away. And if they don't go away, then they get fined a trifling amount that accounts to like half a day's profits or something ridiculous. There seems to be this perception that companies like Google at that kind of like hyperscale level are effectively untouchable due to regulators not having powerful enough threats essentially in their arsenal. And one of the hopes that I saw kind of many privacy advocates and commentators voicing prior to GDPR coming in was that these hefty percentage-based maximum fines would allow regulators to go after Google and companies like that with a kind of similar reputation for flouting the rules fairly or unfairly, earned, that it would give regulators more power to go after them. That doesn't seem to have happened in the way that people were perhaps expecting it might. Do you think it's just a slower process, or has GDPR not been as effective as people may have predicted in enabling governments and data protection authorities to combat these large multinational tech organizations?
So I do think it is a process of awareness and education, not just for large tech companies, but actually companies of all scales and sizes. I do see there being a definite appreciation for the importance of data protection and privacy across the board. And the tech companies were once small startups and maybe did not have that culture of data protection and privacy embedded within them. But that's also changing. I see there being a change in the level of resourcing now in terms of individuals who have privacy data protection expertise being recruited into senior positions within organizations, large in particular. As I mentioned earlier on, they do have quite extensive privacy teams and lawyers advising them on the requirements and the rules. And if the fines are not going to be the driving force, well, certainly the behaviours of their consumers and their shareholders will be. And that's, again, where we're seeing attitudes change, because the headlines do have an impact. They do have an impact on brand. And, there are opportunities for those organizations who recognize that and do something about it and understand. Actually, they will lose consumers. they will lose the trust of their employees and their shareholders if they're found wanting. And perhaps actually it is going to be those organizations that will drive the standards and set the agenda on privacy. I do see there are some who recognise that, and they're very vocal, really, on the steps that they've taken to improve, compliance and governance and accountability on these areas. And perhaps it is a combination of the laws coming in. Obviously, data protection legislation has been around for a long time before the GDPR became effective. But I see that there is this gradual evolution and driving up really of standards, and it's important that all organisations are brought along on that journey. Really important for innovation and for society as a whole.
There's also, the hovering question of Brexit. While obviously the GDPR rules mean that if companies here want to process the data of people living in the European Union, then they have to abide by GDPR. But there has been some suggestion that in the UK, our laws may relax a little bit, you become less strict. Is that something you think is possible or likely? And if so, how is everybody going to take it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because Brexit was so dominant, wasn't it, before COVID? And now, we've slightly taken our eye off that, and it's 7 months away. And yes, what is going to be the impact of Brexit on data protection in the UK? Now, the UK has always been very influential in driving standards and setting those standards in Europe. And I do feel that it's a shame, in a sense, that the ICO is not going to have its place and influence, because I think it's recognised as being, one of the strongest supervisory authorities. So hopefully that will continue post Brexit, and its influence international will continue post Brexit. I think overwhelmingly the issue is one of just uncertainty. For organizations, that is very, very troubling, because they want to continue to operate, they want to continue to offer goods and services into what is an incredibly important region, and actually how is that possible where there's just so much uncertainty about a key player? And as the clock runs down, the prospect is that we are facing a potentially very hard Brexit. And how does this impact the rules on the transfer of data? Systems and organizations will continue to operate globally. And actually, it's worth remembering that it is illegal to transfer European data outside of Europe without there being the right mechanisms in place. And so I know there was a scramble, wasn't there, organisations looking to put European model clauses in place to allow for that transfer, and then also being considered by the European Court of Justice in terms of their validity. So, many organisations left really troubled by the lack of certainty. It is important to remember that that there are mechanisms that can be relied on outside of model clauses, but that's where you need to have the expertise in place to be able to advise. We're certainly seeing as a data protection office an increased level of inquiry into binding corporate rules, BCRs, which are also another mechanism available to a group of companies to allow them to transfer data more freely across their group, but also require organizations to have good, robust data protection programs in place. So to have that governance and accountability in place, to have training in place, to have the policies and procedures in place, to also have regular audits. So they deal with the transfer point, but also deal with much broader data protection hygiene. And really, organizations should be meeting these standards under the GDPR. So I think there's been a lot of focus on that, more kind of holistic look at data governance within an organization. And so I think there will be a sort of a race to the top, that there will be interest in standards such as binding corporate rules or ISO standards or PCI compliance standards. I think really that's going to be the sort of the direction of travel for many organisations, to try and create some certainty in this very uncertain world and period that we're entering.
And I mean, going back to the financial side of things for a minute, almost all of the major services that people rely on, a lot of these services are provided from locations in Europe for various reasons of kind of like property prices and the space to host a data center and tax reasons, all of these things that mean that there's a very real chance that if really hard, really strict data transfer rules come in and, suddenly companies are no longer able to transfer information, in the way that they are now across borders, that could well end up being a major problem. You could suddenly see a huge range of services completely shut off, which would be absolutely catastrophic.
Yeah, absolutely. For the economy, for the individuals who've come to rely very heavily on them, and so I think that's why organisations are looking and preparing for the sort of eventuality of a hard Brexit. And if they're not, I think they should be. My advice to them would be really start to do your preparation now. Understand your global data transfers and start to strategize on, okay, what would be the requirement if you have to appoint a UK data protection officer? Would you appoint somebody internally? Would you look to outsource that? And do you have the capabilities? Also, what if you're required to appoint an EU representative? Who would that be? Just in terms broadly of your data governance, are you in a position to go for those high standards, to attain a binding corporate rule approval? The worst thing to do is really to fail to plan in this time. And so, I think if there's one thing I could advise organisations to do, is to be proactive around this point and start to plan ahead.
So a final question then, Dyann. We are all living in a remote home working environment, whether or not it was something that we were prepared for before March or not. Is there a problem squaring GDPR and GDPR responsibilities with mass remote working? And how can companies fix this if they're currently in a bit of a sticky position?
There are some clear challenges around remote working. And there's been much publicised about the rise of phishing attacks in this environment. And so there has been a focus on security, rightly. And I think it's very important for organisations to ensure, first and foremost, that not just their employees, but also the data that they're custodians of kept safe and well in this period. Beyond security, I think it's thinking about how do they ensure that data protection, privacy are embedded in the day-to-day practice of all their employees. And that's one of the most challenging things, but all the more important where you're not necessarily meeting in the same space, in the same environment on a day-to-day basis. And I think, for those that put the work in where the GDPR became effective, they'll be reaping the rewards of that. For other organisations that are behind, they will simply have to catch up because, as you mentioned, a lot is moving now online. This is the new world. And it's really important that organisations keep up to speed with the expectations of regulators, expectations of their consumers, and expectations of their employees, whose data, including health information, may now be processed on a wider scale within various businesses, given the pandemic. All of which requires organisations to act responsibly and to be accountable in a way that really has been accelerated by the pandemic. Okay, so I think the pandemic obviously has been very challenging for many individuals and organisations. But it's important to remember that there are also opportunities out there. And for those organisations that do adapt and are accountable on data, they are going to lead through all of this and I think reap the rewards as well.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this week. Dyann, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes, and even more on our website, www.itpro.co.uk.
Remember to sign up for your free ticket to our 5-day virtual conference, ITPro Live, and also sign up for the ITPro 2020 digital magazine, the new issue of which will be out on Friday.
Don't forget to subscribe to the IT Pro podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you get podcasts to never miss an episode. And if you'd like to help your peers, friends, and just other people find the podcast, then please leave us a rating and review on your podcast app of choice, and that will increase the amount that people find us. We'll be back next week with more news and analysis from the world of IT. Until then, goodbye.
Bye.
The IT Pro podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.
There's a reason flash storage is called flash storage and not electronic non-volatile computer memory storage. From quick and efficient data retrieval to instant scalability, everything about IBM flash storage is fast. It's also cloud-ready and surprisingly affordable, with a recommended monthly price of 2,200 kroner for 24 terabytes of all flash. Order by the 30th of June and pay nothing for 90 days. Find out more at ibm.biz/flash offer.